Cannot hear? Can you hear now? Thank you. Ladies, quickly take your seats, please. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am Sandy Blumenthal, and I have the honor of presiding at this plenum on North American Jewry and Israel, opinions, attitudes, and concerns. An essential element of the mission of Women's League is to reinforce bonds with Israel and Jews worldwide by nurturing a real sense of Ahavat Zion, a love of Zion, among our members. To that end, the Israel Affairs Department promotes a 6-point program for Israel: Zionist philosophy, support of the conservative Masorti movement in Israel, its synagogues and women's groups, tourism, aliyah, religious pluralism, and social action. Israel is a major component of Women's League. In earlier days, our actions centered around education, fundraising, and political advocacy. In 1950, we declared, "Now therefore be it resolved that the National Women's League of the United Synagogue urge undiminished support of Israel in all areas of endeavor and the free exchange of inspirational cultural relations." In 2012, our resolutions included a commitment to continue and strengthen our support of the Masorti movement in Israel, to encourage and develop programming and information that educates our members on issues relevant to Israel today, including, but not limited to, pluralism and gender discrimination, and to encourage each of our affiliated groups to present at least one Israel program each year. Today, Women's League continues our support of the popular Days of Study for Women in Israel and our Region Israel Special Relationship Masorti Congregation programs. As always, we are dedicated to educating our membership and keeping them well-informed and up-to-date. As the political climate has become increasingly polarized, we struggle to learn about those issues that all North American Jews are talking about. Today, we are honored to have a prestigious panel of Middle East analysts who will engage in a discussion about these issues that are near and dear to our hearts. Mira Kogen Resnick is the senior professional staff member for the Democratic staff on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Who's next, Chara? Chara McMichael serves as the Chief of Staff for Republican Congressman Randy Weber of Texas. Rebecca Shimoni-Stoil is an historian and journalist of the Middle East. I invite you to learn more, and there's so much more, about each of these experts by referring to their biographies in your program book. Please note that their remarks today are as individuals and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of their employers. Ladies, today we are off the record. Our moderator is Barbara Kavadias, I told you, Executive Director of the Masorti Foundation. I now turn our program over to Barbara for what I am sure will be a most interesting and informative afternoon.
Thank you, Sandy. Is this too loud? No. Yes, okay. I do project. So I want to welcome our panelists, and I want to welcome all of you. We are going to tackle some tough issues today: the two-state solution, settlements, Jerusalem, pluralism. Some would say that underlying all of these issues and something we all agree on is Israel's security. And I say we because we, this all-female panel, and you, our audience, because we're going to ask you to participate, we're going to start off with a discussion, and then we're going to get more from you in some questions and answers. We're not going to do Q&A until the end. I ask you to be active listeners. I ask you to be responsive. Feel free to be responsive, but also be respectful and to pay attention to the time as we move forward. So, Gidi Grinstein, who's the founder of the Reut Group, is an Israeli public policy institute she was recently quoted in a Thomas Friedman op-ed after the Knesset, the cabinet of the Knesset decided to freeze the Equality at the Kotel agreement. Gidi was quoted as saying, "This is a moment of truth for Israel's national security and ethos. Does Israel view itself as the nation-state of Israelis or as the nation-state of the entire Jewish people, nearly 60% of whom live outside of Israel? Is the purpose of Israel to serve the continuing resilience, prosperity, and existence of the Jewish people as the founders of Zionism envisioned, or just its own well-being? That is the question at stake now. And that, my friends, is the frame for this discussion today. So I'm going to start off by asking you a question before we turn to the panel. I want to know how many of you, before we start talking about settlements, how many of you have relatives or friends who are living in the West Bank or Jerusalem, East Jerusalem? So this is a topic that we are all part of, and that we should all be caring about. So we're going to start with the settlements. Talking about settlements, some would say, is really a loaded term. Many of the so-called settlements are in the traditionally Jewish lands of Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, and a goodly portion of the population are in areas that many assert will need to be kept by Israel for security purposes. While some have said that, like Gaza, when we are ready to pull out of the West Bank in an exchange for peace, we will do it, others wonder where on earth are we going to put what some estimate is now 420,000 Jewish residents of the West Bank. There's now a whole political party in Israel who believes that these are our lands and that we should keep them. And there are many on the left who are discouraged and who doubt that there is any hope that a peace partner can be found with whom we can hand over the land in exchange for peace. So I'm going to ask all of you one more question before we turn to the panel. How many of you believe that as American Jews, whether you're in Canada or the United States, feel that we should have something to say, that we should have some sway over Israel about what they do or don't do in relationship to the West Bank? If you think we have a say, raise your hands. Okay, so now I'm going to the panel, right? Two of our panelists work for Congress. They work for people who are supposed to represent us. So, Mira, Chara, what do you think? Should Congress have any sway or influence over what Israel does or does not do in relation to these lands?
I have my own. Thanks so much for having us here. Yeah, it's a great question to start with. Settlements are a really tough issue. I would say that Israel enjoys a special relationship with the United States in Congress and historically in the executive branch. And because of that special relationship, Israel doesn't suffer the same kind of consequences when sort of paths diverge on policy matters. So I would say that most Democrats see that there is a way to have these discussions without weighing in with the kind of sanctions that you would see if another country did something that the U.S. didn't like. I don't mean sanctions in the sense that like Iran or Russia sanctions that we're going to be passing in a couple hours, but in the kind of punishment that you see. And so I think that that's not on the table. What is on the table is the kind of rhetoric that you've seen in every administration for the past several dozen years, where where members of Congress and the executive continue to underscore that expanding settlements is and building new settlements is not going to contribute to a final status two-state solution. We see this behind closed doors. We see this in public. We see this play out at the UN. And historically, the administration and Congress together have worked together to find the right balance and the right tone.
Well, from the Republican perspective, I would say we are less inclined to try to push Israel to disband settlements, largely because we have seen time and time again, we've asked Israel to give and give and give to the point of bleeding, and the only thing they've gotten in return is having missiles and terrorists closer and closer to their home territory. Israel is the only nation in all of history that has conquered land and been asked to give it away. It is the only land. It is the only nation in which we don't honor their sovereignty by demanding that they do things that are against their best interests. So in that sense, I think you will see a larger segment of the Republican side that will say, and frankly, a lot of them come from an evangelical Christian perspective that says God's covenant is not void, period. And we have to honor that. So the traditional lands that are spoken of in the scripture regarding Judea and Samaria are lands which most of those, from my perspective, would say they belong to Israel.
So Rebecca, as a historian and someone with a broader perspective, what do you think is the way forward in dealing with these lands and the people living in them?
Well, I thought I ducked the hard question, and then I got a harder one, so just goes to show. Can I say, first of all, welcome to my hometown. I'm probably the only native Arlingtonian in this entire room, but they welcome everybody to my hometown. Now for the actual answer. Yes. The way forward, when it comes down to it, needs to be reflective of the fact that Israel is a functional democracy. And that's something that frequently gets misplaced when we internationalize the conversation about what to do with the lands beyond the 67 boundaries. How's that for an ambivalent term? Because when it comes down to it, a lot of what we see happening in Israel has less to do with what the international community would like to see or even what kinds of pressure it can put on the Israeli government, but rather on the internal pressures within the Israeli government. And so when we try to imagine a path forward, and I know that we will hopefully get to this conversation as we move on this afternoon, we need to understand that a path forward is only as strong and only as resolute in any direction as the coalition that puts it forward. And that, I think, is the most important takeaway, is that the international community can push this way, the United States can push that way, but when it comes down to it, the Prime Minister has to go to sleep and wake up the next morning with their ruling coalition, and that will always be their first and foremost kind of consideration as they move forward beyond the good of the country itself.
I would only add that that beyond the political pressures from the Prime Minister, there has never been a case where Israel is going to make concessions when it feels that its security is at risk. So anything that the United States is going to do has to have that in mind. And Israel is not going to make the necessary risks for peace if it feels like it has a gun to its head. And so therefore, the best way that the US can support a two-state solution and get toward a final status issue that resolves the settlements issue is to ensure that Israel's security is at the foremost of our minds.
So we have a new president. His name is Donald Trump. And so do you think, being people who are working in Congress, do you think that the election of Donald Trump has influenced our policies in any way towards the West Bank? Has there been a change? Has there been some push underlying that we're not hearing about? Like, has there been a change of thinking since the election of Donald Trump?
Gee, I guess that's me. I think the clearest sign that you can see to that is both the ambassador who was appointed to Israel as well as the Middle East envoy, Jason Greenblatt, who actually recently just negotiated a water deal with Israel and the West Bank. And actually he also helps to negotiate the recent situation in Jordan where some Israeli diplomats and workers at the embassy there were attacked, and the attacker was also killed. So he helped to negotiate the release of the embassy personnel so that they could in turn return to Israel. So to that extent, I would say that is a positive. Obviously, having a son-in-law and daughter who are now, I guess, with his daughter of the Jewish faith as well, certainly helps to color that perspective. I am aware of a number of people who are helping to advise him in regards to issues pertaining to Israel. He's also the first president in history who has made comments in regards to the terrorism payments that are going to Palestinians who commit various acts of atrocity against Israel. In fact, the recent Palestinian who slaughtered 3 different people during the recent Shabbat dinner is now receiving $3,150 a month as a result of his actions in prison. So the fact that that is an issue, that is a priority for the president, I think is important.
Let me just check one thing. Can everyone in the room hear Chara? No. I think you need to speak up a little bit.
I would actually completely agree with Chara. One of the surprising, it is normally a very bipartisan issue, but one of the surprises that a lot of us Democrats have had is the White House's deep commitment to finding a peaceful solution in the Middle East. It's been shocking. And the water deal that Chara spoke about was negotiated under the Obama administration and implemented during the Trump administration. The same way that Jason Greenblatt negotiated the release of the Israeli diplomats in Jordan, the Obama administration did the same thing in Egypt several years ago. When Jason Greenblatt went to the West Bank, he met with Palestinian civil society to hear from them. He was on a listening tour. He's been on a listening tour. When in the immediate aftermath of the Kotel crisis, our ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, came out and was very supportive of the American Jewish consensus position that that the Kotel, and I know we're going to discuss Kotel later, but the Kotel issue has to be resolved. The conversion issues have to be resolved. I think that you're finding that this is an administration that is very much continuing the same line as the Obama administration. Maybe not so much in rhetoric. Yeah, there have been some changes in tone, but the actual actions have been the same, to the point where our former ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, was sitting with a group of Jewish Democrats and looked around the room and said, guys, you guys are going to have to figure out how to talk nicely about the president vis-a-vis the peace agreement, because he's doing everything right now.
So Rebecca, do you think the press is reflecting some of these changes and that are not changes by the Trump administration?
Well, I kind of wear 2 hats because generally I write and comment on English-speaking Israeli press, right, which is a very strange category to begin with. and reflects a little tiny demographic with which Mira is very familiar, but most of Washington and perhaps most of the world isn't. I think that one of the challenges for any administration, and I recall back in the days immediately following the conclusion of the Iran deal, there I said Iran deal, it's on the table. Following the conclusion of the Iran deal, we got to a very strange point in the press where things were actually going okay between Jerusalem and Washington. And I remember there was this visit by the energy minister, Yuval Steinitz, who came to America and went on this tour with the chambers of commerce and talked about Israeli natural gas resources and all of these really interesting agreements. And he worked together with the US Secretary of Energy, who had been at odds with Israel famously over the Iran deal. And maybe out of this entire tour, I generated one headline. Why did I only generate one headline? Because things working well don't make news, right? We have a horrible saying, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. And I'm not going to go quite that melodramatically. But to say that things are actually kind of working along a status quo with a couple of exceptions here and there is a hard headline to sell to an editor. And if you do sell it to an editor, the chance that anybody's actually going to click on, well, things are actually kind of going the way they were, is not the kind of thing that measures itself well by clickbait standards. So yes, perhaps it's being undercovered, but it's being undercovered because things are kind of okay.
Thank you. Closely related to the question of the settlements is the two-state solution, which many believe is undermined by the expansion of the settlements in the West Bank. So first I want to ask Chara and Mira, is there still bipartisan support for a two-state solution in Israel?
Did you want to go first?
I think the answer is yes.
Yes. I find myself negotiating a lot on this because I do think that in the beginning of the administration, there was a little bit of reticence to come out full force for the words two-state solution. And we have worked really hard in the last 6 months, both Republicans who are supportive of the two-state solution and Democrats, to make it so that this is not a dirty word. That is also thanks to people like you who are supportive of the two-state solution, who called your member of Congress and said, we still support this and we want you to support it too.
I was going to say, I absolutely agree with Mira. At the end of the day, we all want peace for all of those within the region. The only real difference, I think, between Republicans and Democrats isn't the end goal, it's how we get to that goal. And so that's where the negotiation comes in.
I mean, as we mentioned earlier, there's people on the right and the left in Israel who are very discouraged, and they're really wondering what the path forward is. Where does Congress think the path forward is? How can we both secure Israel, keep it safe, and have a two-state solution? What kind of bright ideas do Congress have?
Defer to the State Department. I think that there are a lot of ways that Congress can be helpful. One of which, as I was speaking about earlier, is ensuring that Israel doesn't feel like it's making blind risks toward peace, and that's ensuring that Israel's military aid package continues year to year, and we have a 10-year memorandum of understanding now to guarantee that. And that means that Israel can plan for its security over the next 10 years. That means that as it's contemplating various ways to go about the peace process, it knows that the U.S. is going to be there with money to ensure that that happens. I also think that there are ways that our committee works with the administration, and sometimes a little antagonistic toward the administration to ensure that there's proper oversight on what the administration is doing. So I think that you saw a lot of that. As Chara mentioned, the Palestinian prisoner payments is a issue that is very much in the press, and very much on the minds of Israelis and Americans who care about this issue. The bill, the Taylor Force Act, was named in honor of a young veteran, West Point graduate who was in Israel, not Jewish. He was there on a study tour. He was stabbed and killed. Just a few miles away from where Vice President Biden was having dinner. It's argued that because the Palestinian Liberation Organization, not the PA itself, but through the PLO, they pay the prisoners and their families for violent crimes. For terrorism, and what we should do about it, and do we condition U.S. assistance to the Palestinians based on that? And this is something that Congress is now dealing with. There will be the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will be taking it up this week, and I expect that the House will do the same at some point in the near future. And this is another way where the U.S. is trying to lower the incitement, to eliminate the incitement, so that Israel can feel confident in its endeavors toward peace.
I would probably add to that one of the things that I think Congress, as well as you can do, is work towards changing the tone within the region as a whole. I'm from Texas. I think in analogies. So one of the analogies that I've always used in reference to the Palestinian people is that they are, in essence, the Alamo. They're the rallying cry for Islamic individuals all over the world. As long as they are oppressed, put down, meant to be in a situation or thought to be in a situation that is not of their choosing or of the choosing of the Islamic world, it gives a lever for incitement, not only against Israel but against the United States. So I think before ultimately we can ever have a two-state solution, there's two things that have to happen. One, we have to change that tone. We have to change the need for them to keep the Palestinians oppressed. And two, we also need to build up the Palestinians in terms of economic stability. Statehood will never, ever happen, and I've heard this specifically from Palestinians with whom I've worked within the West Bank and in Gaza. Statehood will never, ever work if they don't even know how to run a government, and frankly, they don't. And that's not only from the top level, but all the way down to hospital boards, school boards, just civil society in general is largely run by organizations that also have a terrorist arm. So until we can change those two things, frankly, I don't know that we will ever truly have a two-state solution.
Rebecca, what do you think about the role that women can play in Israel or the United States? Maybe you're more familiar with what women can do in Israel to promote some kind of peace settlement in Israel.
Again, these softballs, I don't know. So historically, we've seen that in Israel, because of the structure of Israeli society, women's voices have had almost, I don't want to say disproportionate when you're 50% of the population, maybe 52%, but they've had a very strong role in shaping kind of the court of public sentiment. So I think about the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon as a result of continued pressure by an organization at its basis were bereaved mothers of combat soldiers. And while there is now this only happens when I talk. Well, if you can't tell, there's this light that goes on and off. And I think that given the fact that right-wing or left-wing in Israel, a lot of Israeli society kind of spins on this head of the soldiers and of the military experience. And so much of the job of narrating out the soldiers and the military experience is carried out by the mothers of Israeli soldiers. That is an incredibly powerful engine driving Israeli diplomatic policy. I can't think of a country in which that's comparably the case. And that is a number of factors. As the mother of 3 Israeli dual citizens, I hope that people listen to me too when my kids are in the army. But I do think that it puts Israel and Israeli women in a very unique position of ability to impact social and particularly diplomatic change.
And how about here in the United States?
Oh, like you guys.
If you want, or
yeah,
we can ask. Yeah.
Well, as a current resident of Baltimore, yay! As a current resident of Baltimore, we of course reflect back on our perhaps most illustrious woman, Jewish community member, Henrietta Szold. And what we learned from her case, I'm wearing the historian hat, not the if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead hat. And what we learned from her case, and I heard a story about mahjong and Jewish education that was told here earlier. We know that Jewish women as a group are very good at organizing themselves. And they've been very good at organizing themselves for at least the past century in America, and possibly earlier when my great-great-grandmother saw her friends jumping out of the windows of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And that became a vehicle for Jewish women's organization and mobilization. And we've seen the ability of the Jewish community, and particularly the Jewish women within the community, to form a powerful bloc. But we have a really big challenge right now. And it's lovely that right now on stage we're really, really bipartisan. But what I've seen in the Jewish community in recent years is a little bit of that slipping away. And we sometimes within the Jewish community, and I'm using a royal we as a Jewish woman, focus on the details that separate out our perspectives rather than focusing on the common denominators that underscore them. And I think that's true for the entire pro-Israel community as a whole, incidentally. And so I think that while we have the capacity of being a very powerful voice and of remaining a very powerful voice, that will mostly come when we remember the common denominators rather than looking for the points of fracture that separate us.
So I want to ask one more question about the settlements. It's maybe a little bit of a controversial question. If Messiah comes, now if Israel does achieve a 2-state agreement, since Israel has many Arab citizens living in the state of Israel with full equal rights, they serve as justices, some of them serve in the army, they're an integral part of Israeli society. Why shouldn't Israel and world opinion insist that the Palestinian state allow Jews to be citizens there?
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yay! Well, first and foremost, I'm going to give a nod over here to Chara and say that one of the most important enterprises for those who believe that any sort of a 2-state solution is going to be the outcome, whether or not they like it, is building up a functional Palestinian polity, right? One of the challenges toward building up a Palestinian polity is that that also has to reflect a certain amount of democratic values on the part of the people who are forming that government. And there was an unfortunate experiment with that we saw in Gaza shortly after disengagement where, what do? You have democratic elections and then you elect Hamas. But the larger question of, say, what would a Palestinian Bill of Rights look like? What, for that matter, and I don't want to step on a sore point that maybe we'll get to later, what would an Israeli Bill of Rights look like? What would an Israeli constitution look like if there were one? What would a Palestinian constitution look like? One of the reasons that we see some ambiguity about citizenship and who's in and who's out, and it's not just about Jews, it's also about Christian Palestinians who live in a very tenuous kind of position, right? All of these questions are questions that are going to need to get solved, yes, perhaps with some international movement here and there, but also fundamentally within the polities in which they're going to have to continue to exist.
You want to touch this?
No, okay.
So, Jerusalem has a special place in the heart of the Jewish people. We pray towards Jerusalem. We've lived there continually since we built it, though at times in very reduced and terrible conditions. At the same time, other faiths have strong ties there, some so strong that they consider them claims. There are parts of Jerusalem that some see as occupied territory. They don't think it is part of Israel, though we see it as our capital. At the same time, when the Masorti movement when the Masorti Foundation posted celebratory posts about Yom Yerushalayim Day, when we celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem, I actually received criticism from rabbis who wrote to me to ask me why we weren't more critical of the holiday. So let me ask you first, in the audience, how many of you feel that Jerusalem should stay unified as we move forward? So you see what the hands look like. Where's Congress heading in this direction? Where do you think Congress and where do you think the American people? You see what the room looks like. Where do you think they're headed with Jerusalem question?
So we just celebrated 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, and to celebrate, the Senate passed a resolution honoring the reunification, the resolution touched back to previous resolutions and laws that Congress has passed lauding the reunification. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. I think for members of Congress, it's going to be up to Israel to have to make concessions on Jerusalem, and I think that in the end, the American members of Congress will figure out how to deal with whatever Israel decides. Israeli policymakers will tell members of Congress behind closed doors that Jerusalem is on the table, but they're not going to go into the borders. They're not going to go into how to administer Jerusalem. They're not going to go into that with us at this point. There's a lot that has to be dealt with before Israel is going to make any sort of concession on the biggest prize, on Jerusalem. That to the Palestinians is the Holy Grail, and Israel has a lot to do before getting to any discussion on Jerusalem.
Holy Grail or not for the Palestinians, I would point you to Psalms 122 and indicate, Holy Grail or not, I would point you to Psalm 122, and I would say that is the guiding force behind why my boss in particular and others of his ilk will say that Jerusalem will never be on the table. It will always remain the undivided capital of Israel as long as he is concerned.
Rebecca. So what do you make of the claim that there is more access and protections for all faiths and for their religious sites under Israeli authority than there was under Jordanian rule, or would potentially be if the Palestinians had a hand in ruling, I guess, Jerusalem?
Well, as a journalist, I have 20/20 hindsight and 20/20 now sight, but 20/24 sight is a power only given, to Solomon. But given that, I would say that with my 20/20 hindsight, the answer is yes, of course that's a true statement. I mean, it's factually true that Jews did not have access to the Kotel, to the holy sites. Not only did Jews not have access, and this is an important thing that I think got kind of pushed aside in our conversations about Yom Yerushalayim. It wasn't just that Jews did not have access to holy sites between 1948 and 1967. It's that Jewish synagogues were dynamited in the Old City. When I first moved to Israel, there was the beautiful reconstructed curve of the arch of the Horva synagogue, right? And I was actually shocked when I saw a picture of it, perfectly intact, that had been taken 50 years earlier. I thought this was like an ancient ruin. I had no idea that this had been dynamited within my parents' lifetime. And so the question about the state of holy sites under Israeli law is simply not a question. Yes, there is more access. Is it always perfect? No. Is it perfect for Jews? No. Can Jews pray on the Temple Mount? No. Do Muslims have access to the sites, all the sites they want at the times that they want? Thinking of the dividing up of Marat HaMachpelah, for instance? No. Is it perfect? No. But is it better than what we've seen in the past? 100%. Yes. And so just based on past performance, we can pretty much stipulate that Israel has been as good as it gets regarding protection of access for everybody to holy places, and it's unlikely to anticipate that anything else would be better.
Chara, I think your district has a lot of Christians in your district, correct? So have they talked to you about this at all in terms of, as a Christian, having access to Christian sites in Jerusalem?
As far as throughout all of Jerusalem or even Israel, Christians do have access to all the holy sites, not only holy to Jews, but also to Christians. We, however, do have to petition to be able to go to Bethlehem, as a for instance. There are a number of sites throughout all of Israel that I have been to without having to petition, without having to ask. I can freely walk in. I can freely walk out. I do not have the ability, for example, to go to Rachel's tomb. I do not have the ability to go to Bethlehem, but I do throughout all of Israel. I would also point out that if you want to consider, again, what it would look like under other rule, like Jordan or like the Palestinians, then I think you would have to look at how much access you have to Islamic holy sites, period. And then reflect back to, for example, I can't go to Mecca or Medina because I'm not Muslim. I also, ironically, have to go through significant security, even as a Muslim, to enter any of those sites. But now we have an issue that required Israel to pull metal detectors from the holy site in order to calm down some of the angst, shall we say, that was happening within the Palestinian community.
Under Israel's declaration for the formation of the State of Israel, we were guaranteed freedom of religion and a right to exercise personal conscience. We don't have a constitution yet, we don't have a Bill of Rights, but we do have a declaration for the formation of the State of Israel. And while Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and others usually feel that their rights and their freedom is respected in Israel, making Israel, I think, somewhat of an anomaly in the Middle East, ironically, not all Jews do, including Masorti and Reform Jews, where they feel it is perhaps the only place where we do not have the same freedoms or the same respect that we have in all other democracies in the free world. The taxpayer-funded mikvaot are no longer open to us as Masorti Jews. There's a bill to recognize only conversions that are done by the Rabbanut in Israel. To be married as a Jew, as some of you have talked to me during this convention, to be married as a Jew in Israel, you must do it through the Rabbanut, and your conservative, Masorti, or Reform rabbi cannot conduct that marriage and be recognized as a Jewish marriage in the State of Israel. And after more than a year and a half since the Kotel Agreement was signed, voted on by the cabinet, the government has now taken a step back from that agreement and has frozen it. And that agreement would have not only established an egalitarian prayer space at the Kotel, but it would have included formal recognition of the Masorti and Reform movements in Israel and allowed us to actually manage that site ourselves and to be seen as bona fide movements, parts of Judaism in Israel. Many of us are feeling betrayed and let down. As women in government and journalism, what impact do these actions have on you and your feelings towards the State of Israel? And I'm going to ask a few more questions that's related to that. Do you use a gender prism as you look at some of these things, or only a religious prism? And do you feel that a gender prism is relevant as we look at these questions? Rebecca is dying to answer this question, so I'm going to let her go first.
So, can I take a minute and tell a little story? Okay. I'll tell you a story. My husband and I were married in the state of New Jersey in 2007, 2 years after I finished my IDF service, while I was working in Israel as the internal security correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. We got married in New Jersey because my grandfather was sick and couldn't travel. And when we got back from America, I went to the Rabbanut, to the rabbinate's office in Jerusalem. It took me a while. It took me about 9 months to get there, which meant that I was about 6 months pregnant. And all of you are saying, Jewish grandchildren, yes. And I got to the Rabbanut with my husband in tow, who's a native-born Israeli. And I said at the Rabbanut, hello, we'd like to register our marriage. And the gentleman looked, I wore a skirt for the occasion. And the gentleman looked at us and said, so who's the rabbi? And I told him the name of the rabbi. And he said, nope, can't do it. And I said to him, hold on. I went to a Jewish day school. And at my Jewish day school, I learned that Isha niknet b'shlosha doachim, kesef, shtar, and diya. You acquire a woman through 3 ways: the exchange of money, the exchange of a contract, and that other thing which is proven by my 6 months of pregnancy. And the guy said, that's great, no marriage. And I said, but it's Mishnah. And he said, no marriage. So to this day, my husband and I are actually what I choose to call gay married. We're civilly married in the state of Israel because the state of Israel still will not recognize our halachic Jewish wedding. So that's my little story on this. So you asked me, through what prism do I reflect this as a journalist? One of the nice things about being a news reporter is that you have a serious ethical drive to take yourself out of it. And it's really, really difficult. And thank God, one of the beautiful things about covering the Knesset, unlike Congress, is that you can sit down with members of Knesset in the MK's dining room and talk to them completely off the record, one-on-one, without any of you, like press secretaries, media advisors, et cetera, around. And you can say things to them like, you know, this is really a personal problem for me. I don't expect you to solve it because that would be a violation of ethics, but you got to know it really bugs me. And then you get it out of your system and then you write the article about the bill that's looking to further enforce your inability to be Jewishly married in the Jewish state. So I think that on a personal level, it's a challenge as a journalist always because